welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about SIEM security. So, how many of you have security in your application? Of course, right? Now the question is, how many of you use either custom code or the Jazz annotations or some sort of built-in Jazz at the server, the Java standard? So, what's interesting is that you get a little bit of flexibility with the built-in stuff, and most of your applications, though, you realize that you're doing most of your security in custom logic. So we're going to look at what SIEM can do for us to try to eliminate some of that custom logic and the flexibility that can give us to get real fine-grained in our security. So the objective today is to discover the wide array of options you have for securing your application with SIEM security. So here's what the security needs are. This was the objectives, really, of the SIEM project as the security module was being developed. Number one, it should be very simple to set up. You know, if it's hard to set up security, then you don't set up security, and then you have an insecure app, right? This is what happens with the developers. They get in this bind where they say, you know, that's just too difficult. Let's just roll without it for now. So it needs to be easy to set up. It should be easy to manage. And finally, the application should not outgrow it. This is really important, and I feel oftentimes applications outgrow the standard security mechanisms in Java EE. So we're going to see how you can start simple, but you never get to the point where you've outgrown the model that SIEM's offering you. So let's first just touch base on the security principles, establish a base here, and then we'll move on and look at how this is implemented in SIEM. So there's three security principles. You have an identity, and that's who you are. You're in the application, it recognizes you. With that identity comes roles and groups. And this is the standard identity that you would get in the Java Enterprise Edition. Authentication, which some people often confuse with identity, is proving that you're you, right? So you know some secret, your password, a token, a Java card, whatever have you, and you need to prove that that identity is yours. And then finally, authorization is who is allowed to pass. You know, who's allowed in this section of the code. But it goes beyond just that. It's also, what about this particular resource, this record in the database? Who can see this record in the database? So it's not just a section of the application, it's not just a URL, it's not just part of a page, but it's the specific objects that are on that page. So let's start with authentication. You can get started with authentication in SIEM in three simple steps. Now this is the baseline, basic, entry-level authentication in SIEM. Then we'll look at doing it a little bit more sophisticated. So first you have to declare an authentication method. This is something that says, Boolean yes or no, you're logged in. Those credentials are okay. Create a JSF login form. And then finally, you need to write that authentication method, fill it out with the actual logic. So first, step 0. Let's back up a second. Security is a core concern in SIEM. What that means is there's no extra jar file, and there's no extra separate configuration file or anything like that you have to set up to get started with SIEM, security. It offers you authentication, both of the preemptive type and the lazy type. So preemptive is, I'm going to YouTube, for instance. I know I want to do something with my account, so I go directly to the login page, because it's not even worth doing something until I get authenticated. I know that. Lazy would be they hit something that requires them to be logged in. SIEM has built-in support for taking them to the login page, getting them logged in, however many times it takes for them to try, and then taking them back to where they were, including the parameters that were active at the time. So you get this built in, which normally you would have to go ahead and worry about. Authorization we'll look at, and then finally, if you want to get started with security in SIEM, a good way to do it is to take SIEMgen or the SIEM Wizard and JBus tools and create a SIEM project that way, because you get all of this stuff set up for you to try. So number one, well, back to number one, declare an authentication method. So there's a couple of almost non-requirements for this method. Let's look at it that way rather than as requirements. Number one, it has to take no arguments, and that's really the only requirement. It returns a Boolean that says, yes, those credentials are good, or no, those credentials are no good, try again. And then finally, it has to be accessible via the EL, which is pretty simple in SIEM. It just has to be a SIEM component. And in the SIEM component descriptor, you just say, using the EL syntax, this is how you get to my authentication method. Once you do that, you have activated authentication in SIEM. Now you just have to collect those credentials from the user, so you have something to check. So using a standard JSF form, which is very important because this is a hurdle if you're using JSF to actually use JSF for your login form with the standard Java EE security mechanism. So in Seam, you're going to stay within JSF, or Wicket if you're using the Wicket module. So you bind to the credentials in two input text. Well, one's an input text, one's an input secret, obviously, for the stars for the password. And then finally, Seam also has built-in Remember Me support. So it'll remember that username for the next time they log in. And it also allows you to do things like bring up the preferences of a user before they log in based on this cookie. So that's all it is, and then you call a built-in component called identity with the login method. Now this is separate from the authenticate method. You're not calling your authenticate method directly. You're calling the login method, which uses the authenticate method as a callback. And we'll talk about that in a second. So here's the authentication method. You inject both the credentials and the built-in identity component. So the credentials are holding the username and password from the form, and the identity component is the built-in component in Seam that's taking care of all this for you. Now, within this method, you can do whatever you want. You could talk to a JPA backend, as we're doing here. You could do LDAP, you could do a web service, you could do whatever you want. This is one of the important things in Seam, is that if you have your own fancy way of doing login, you can tie that into Seam very easily. Once you return true on this method, then what Seam does is it goes and creates you a real identity principal in Jazz, right, in Java EE. So the rest of the application behaves as though you would use the standard mechanism. It uses the Seam login module, which implements the login module in Jazz. So all you have to do is say yes or no, and then you can add some roles here that get added to the user's principal. But what if you don't want to write that method? What if writing that method is either tedious, or you want to have it be configurable across applications? Maybe you want to switch to LDAP and JPA, and you don't want to write all of that logic, because obviously the LDAP logic is a bit more complex. What you can do is you can take your entities in JPA and add a couple, just sprinkle in a couple of annotations here. You sprinkle in the user principal, the user password. You can specify that you want the password to be hashed, and Seam takes care of checking against a hash password. And then you can map to a roles table. And then the role entity would then have this role name annotation. So you can get all of that set up. Once you do, you tell Seam these are the two classes. Now they can be named anything you want. They can be user account, member account, whatever, and they could be user role, member role. It doesn't matter what the name of the class is, because it's all annotation based. From that point, Seam will know how to authenticate you into the database. So you no longer have to write this method. This identity store replaces that. Okay, now that we've got the user logged in, let's talk about protecting the application, the really important part. We know who they are, but let's control what they're allowed to do. So Seam has a wide array of authorization styles. You can either do binary authorization. This is something I sort of invented in my book. It's binary because you're either logged in or you're not logged in. And it separates the members from the guests. This is the most coarse-grained way of doing it. Then from there you can move on to role-based. This is something you would be familiar with if you're using the Java EE authentication. This stereotypes the users. You know, you're an admin, you're an editor, you're a viewer. What are you allowed to do if you have this generic role? Everyone who's a viewer is seen as the same. Everyone who's an admin is seen as the same. And so they're really privilege levels, and oftentimes one of the privilege levels will trump another. So admin tends to trump everything. So if you have admin, it doesn't matter what else you have.